the Warriors are back in the playoffs. They start in a couple days against the Kings. I like playoff basketball. And yesterday, Ryan and I were talking about players we grew up watching that we think would be even better today. And Steve Young's my all-time favorite athlete because you allowed me to meet him when I was 7 years old. Another one of my favorite athletes when I was growing up, Chris Mullin. He was at his best when I was about 4. And I loved watching him play. It strikes me that today, the way the NBA's evolved with all the three-point shooting, he would be even better and a bigger star than he was. And I know you covered most of his career. What do you think of that statement, and what do you remember about covering him?
Okay, I agree with you. If in a way, Curry changed the league. He made the three-pointer so prevalent.
Yeah.
Chris was a great shooter. I'm not going to say he was as great as Curry because I don't know if anyone was. But Chris was a great shooter. And if he were playing in this era, I think he'd be almost unstoppable.
He'd have a green light. I mean, my goodness.
Yeah, he'd have a green light. I think he'd be almost unstoppable.
Yeah.
I know Chris very well. I covered him when he came in as a rookie. And Chris and I grew up in the same neighborhood. Now, I'm 17 years old. I grew up on Avenue L at one end, and he grew up at Avenue L on the other. We used to go to the same Chinese restaurant, the New China Inn, separately. But we were in the same neighborhood, and he used to play in all the gyms around. And one time he asked me, Lowell, what junior high did you go to? And I said, Huddy. That was what was called Huddy. And he said, oh, God, I used to play in that gym. He was walking distance from his house, and he used to play at Huddy all the time. So we really are from the same neighborhood. I am wild about Chris Mullin. When I think of players that I've covered that I have affection for, Chris is one of them. I have an interesting story that I mentioned to Iggy this morning. A lot of you people are young, and you may not remember that Chris had a drinking problem. And I guess he's what you call a recovering alcoholic. I mean, he's very serious, a very serious guy about this. But one time, Don Nelson was the coach. It was his first time around as the coach. This thing's falling out of my ears. I'm sorry.
Okay.
So we were, they were practicing at the Mormon temple up in the hills by us, Iggy. Mm-hmm. And they have a gym there. And there was some reason they couldn't practice that day at the arena. I don't know why. And when the practice was over, Chris wasn't there. And people were saying, where's Chris? And Don Nelson said, Chris has a drinking problem, and he's gone, to a facility to work this out, which was obviously the big news of the day and very shocking and very sad. But for Chris, it worked out great. It worked out great. And I do remember when the facility was in the East Coast, and when he was finally left it, when he was okay, the person who picked him up and gave him a ride home was McEnroe, John McEnroe. And isn't that interesting?
That is interesting.
They obviously, when you're a great athlete, Chris was from Brooklyn, McEnroe from Queens. When you're a great athlete in high school, you probably know each other. You probably get banquets together. You get to know each other. Yeah. So I thought that was very touching. Also, Chris graduated from, he always went to Catholic school, and he graduated from a high school in Brooklyn called Xaverian, where he was, all great and all of this. Richie Aurelia, the Giants' former shortstop, went to Xaverian. He's from Brooklyn, too. And he was in the same class as Chris's younger brother, Terrence. So Aurelia was friendly with the Mullin family. There's all kind of little strands,
That's interesting. Yeah.
Go
ahead.
I'm sorry. And when I published my book a couple of years ago, Gloves Off, I needed, it's standard, you get someone to write a little blurb on the back cover of the book. And the 3 people who I felt close enough and I admired to write blurbs were Chris, Brent Jones, and Dusty Baker, of course. How could you not have Dusty? And Steve Young and Brian Murphy wrote the forewords.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I loved watching Mullin play, and it felt like he was ahead of his time. Like that whole Run TMC, Don Nelson, they were ahead of their time. Like they were small ball, and it wasn't necessarily the best way to play in the 90s. There were different rules, but now everyone plays that way. And I just can imagine Chris Mullin playing with today's rules, shooting as many threes as he wanted. He'd be a lot of fun. On the same team as Steph, it'd be a lot of fun.
Oh boy, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mentioned to Iggy when I talked to George Karl when he was coaching the Warriors, and he loved Chris Mullin, and he said, when Chris retires, the factory of passing in the NBA will shut down. He said that Chris was just the greatest passer he ever saw. He was not a great defensive player, great shooter, great passer, great teammate, all of that. Yeah. And what Chris told me was he was so calm during games that during an NBA game, it felt just like he was shooting in the gym, playing in the gym. There are certain people who have that calmness. I never would. But he said that's how he felt.
Yeah, and his skill was, again, like you said, the shooting and the passing. What did he say? They shut down the factory of that? Yeah. I mean, that skill, and that's what is so important in today's game. Like, in the past, you would walk the ball up the court, and you'd throw the ball into the low post, and then you'd give it to Kareem Abdul-Jabbar or Michael Jordan or Karl Malone or Charles Barkley, and he'd go one-on-one and either get fouled or score. And that was the game. Yeah. And now you can't play that way anymore. And a guy like Chris Mullin, who can dribble and pass off the dribble or shoot off the dribble or shoot threes, I mean, he would be devastating. And whereas a guy like Charles Barkley might not be as good because he can't shoot. And he didn't necessarily, he couldn't defend multiple positions. Be interesting.
Yeah. Also, Chris is a lefty. And I think lefties in sports have an advantage. I do.
I agree.
Steve was a lefty.
They're unorthodox.
Yeah, you have to do different things. Yeah, they come the different way.
Yeah, boxers, pitchers, quarterbacks. It's all awkward. Yeah.
That was one of the things that Bill Walsh loved about Steve Young because, first of all, Bill was a lefty. He was also a lefty, and he thought of the world that way, and he knew that as a righty, the defense is always lined up a certain way. Right. Against the lefty, they had to change everything.
Yeah.
So he was intrigued by many things about Steve, but his left-handedness was part of it. And I've never talked to Chris about his left-handedness, but I bet he has an answer to that. Chris is very smart. That's the other thing. He's a very bright guy and a very sweet man.
Remember what James Harden was doing to the league 4 years ago, scoring 35, 40 points a game, being a bit of a ball hog? Chris Mullin could have put up those kind of numbers without being a ball hog. He could have been James Harden. Yeah, he could shoot like Harden or better, pass like Harden or better, but he also wasn't he was in better shape than Harden, a better defender than Harden. That kind of guy. He could have been an MVP candidate. Although he might have been. I don't know. He was on the dream team.
He was on the dream team. Yeah. Iggy, for what it's worth, when I used to cover the NBA, I hated to watch Harden play. All he wanted to do was have the ball, drive, and get fouled. And get fouled. I just hated him. One thing about that, and I told you and I forgot to mention, sometimes I would talk about basketball with Chris, and he said when he would drive to the hoop, he used to do it pretty quick. And Don Nelson, who was very crafty, said, go slower through the key because you'll attract more fouls and it'll be 3 points. So Chris consciously tried to slow down on his strides through the key to pick up the foul as he got the layup.
That's very clever.
Yeah.
I should have done that when I was in the playground. Sorry I'm late. Nice to see you guys. This is Double B Studio. Nice to see you too. Hi. Rod Simmons says, at Lowell, any Walsh's type left, he developed his quarterbacks.
Oh, boy, Iggy would know that better than I do. I know there's no one on the 49ers like that. Bill did. I got to tell you, Bill really did develop quarterbacks. And now, again, I said he was a lefty, but I saw him working sometimes with right-handed quarterbacks. Bill would take the ball in his right hand and throw it, and he could simulate the action even though he was a lefty. He was really serious about it. He watched Jeff Garcia at San Jose State, and he knew this was an NFL talent. He knew it. And when he wanted to bring Jeff to the team, Mariucci couldn't see it and didn't want him. And Bill said, you're going to get him. And it turned out right. And to his credit, Mariucci was finally able to see it.
I think Mariucci actually wanted to cut him at first. And I think Mariucci told the story. I think Mariucci told the story. He had him, didn't see it, wanted to cut him. Bill Walsh insisted. Mariucci said, hey, you're Bill Walsh, absolutely, and eventually saw it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Double B Studio says, lunchtime, got a super burrito, probably not going to finish it. Got the lime, the green sauce, horchata. That sounds like a lot of fun. But yeah, you can never actually finish the burrito. It's huge. It's like 2,000 calories.